Are you going live? It looks like you already went live, but nothing's showing on the Zoom.
Should be there, shouldn't it?
Huh, I don't see anything. Oh, your screen share's not up. There you
Okay. Yes, live stream. 21 May. Dis and dat information today. Rent and surplus. This may seem a little problematic on the one hand. On the other hand, this is probably where I've been headed all along. And so I came across an interesting article that discusses R.T. Ely, and as long as one sort of ignores his, with respect, a certain racism, um, the basic theory, I think, is sort of useful that his own place in the history of institutional economics, along with people like Veblen, etc., are important. And so it's an interesting little paper and fairly recent and discusses the larger implications of trying to address certain questions about the relationship between surplus value, and rent or rent theory. So onward, it is it's interesting in this article that certain ideas that are certainly there in terms of institutional economics or the new institutional economics are certainly available in an earlier form by the work of R.T. Ely. And a lot of his work tends to be, let's just say, they're probably ignored. And they may have been ignored simply because of that little thing about racialism that seeps into his work. That shouldn't discredit some of his basic ideas, which are useful from a heterodox point of view. So we'll begin here. I hope to get to the end of the article. Theories of rent are wide ranging. However, whether neoclassical, Marxist, or Proudhonist, they tend to neglect evolutionary institutionalist theorizing. Increasingly dominated by the income approach, rent theories need to be expanded, partly to correct existing work, partly to break persistent intellectual monopoly and oligopoly, and particularly to develop institutional theories of rent. In this paper by Franklin Obeng Udom, called The Surplus Approach to Rent, he attempts to do so by presenting and evaluating the surplus approach to rent, particularly R.T. Ely's, highlighting its power and potential and stressing its critiques and contradictions. Drawing, among others, on the original writings of Ely, it is argued that while the emphasis on property rights, land as a bundle of sticks, and rent as surplus rather than income help to advance heterodox approaches to rent. The surplus approach is severely limited in its analysis of inequalities and how they can be addressed, especially in extractivist and rentier societies. To unravel long-term inequalities that characterize rent and rentier economies, it is crucial for surplus theorists, that is, theorists of surplus value, to engage stratification economics, which in turn can drive the surplus approach to rent. So, rent and income. Neoclassical economists define rent as the price paid for the use of land obtained in a competitive market. Therefore, rent is an open market price paid for the use of land, much like interest is income for the use of capital. In this income approach, rent functions as a driver of growth. Also, rent, like price, more generally becomes a mechanism for allocating land as a scarce resource. The surplus approach to rent is rather different, advanced by a wide range of classical and other economists, including the physiocrats, Smithians, Ricardians, Georgists, institutionalists, Marxists, and the French regulationists. Rent is not simply the return price for the use of land. It's also surplus. Every surplus approach offers a critique of approaches in neoclassical economics and their related policy prescriptions, but the surplus approach also provides a comprehensive and coherent alternative framework to analyze extractivism and other socio-ecological problems. In practice, the surplus approach also offers a springboard for developing practical transformative steps and policies to change the world. Beyond these generalities, the surplus approach has many nuances. Various theorists have debated what land rent is and what it is not. Many analysts focus on regimes of growth, particularly the French regulationists, for example, Fadot, the work of Robert Boyer, and its intensive discussion, etc. When determining how to address inequality, they deal with the question of rent as a surplus. But how to deal with that surplus and whether to emphasize growth or inequalities, land or capital varies widely. Generally, in the surplus approach, a critical question is whether to reinvest the surplus to expand and transform the existing economic system. Recall circuits of capital. Whether the surplus should be wasted in luxury consumption leading to economic decline, or whether to redistribute the surplus for inclusive economic development. What proportion of land rent should be returned to the landowner? Should a landowner whose laboring activities help to improve land rent be compensated, or should all land rent be given back to society? Richard T. Ely, a pioneering institutional economist, sought to provide new answers to these questions. He did so by emphasizing land, especially redefining land, reintegrating economics and law through land, and bringing in the courts as arbiter to the land rent question. Accordingly, Ely's focus was not so much on growth, but rather on how land rent is an instrument for creating and maintaining systemic inequality, and in what ways inclusive prosperity or well-being might be nurtured in an ecologically sound society. These contributions are of continuing importance. 3 reasons to help make the point. The first is that the Revue de la Régulation is seeking to bring back the rent approach to the political economy of the Régulation school at a time when the study of extractivism is at the crossroads on whether to give any place to earlier rentier state analysis pioneered by Hossein Mahdavi. The second is that the rent approach to the study of inequality has been marginalized in political economy, which is increasingly centered on labor and capital and their growth, rather than on land and its place in redistribution. In the USA, Piketty shows that inequality levels have reached 1910 to 1920 levels of between 45 to 50% wealth concentration in the hands of the top 10% of the population in that country. Oxfam reports that 85 people now have the same wealth as half of the world. The attempts to explain this inequality has typically focused on capital and labor. For example, Piketty's contributions have largely focused on the capital income ratio. In general, a careful analysis of land and property rights has largely been ignored, as Robert Rawthorne pointed out in his review of Piketty's work for the Cambridge Journal of Economics. Much like Piketty's work, the Oxfam report focuses on total wealth and the proportion going to the class of capitalists, while others demand attention to labor, but only make superficial or rhetorical comments about land-based inequality. A third and final reason for the continuing importance of Ely's contribution is that he has been overlooked as, excuse me, as an institutionalist. Ely gradually disappeared from American social sciences after the early 20th century. Neoclassical thought made every attempt to limit his place in the history of thought, granting him only a few mundane lines in the new Palgrave. Institutionalism is well developed in modern political economics, but its relationship to land and property rights, especially as echoed in the work of Richard Theodore Ely, is poorly understood. The entries on institutionalism in the Encyclopedia of Political Economy make no reference to Ely, although he is the progenitor of institutional political economy, the founder of land economics, the dean of American economists, and the founding editor of the field's preeminent journal, Land Economics, initially called the Journal of Land and Public Utility Economics. The existing work on Ely is so little that it can be easily summarized. One type is biographical, looking at the life and contribution of Ely. Another is laudatory of his proposals, while the third is entirely dismissive of the political proposals of Ely about war, unions. For example, Bradiza's book and Roca's book chapter are some of the rare recent contributions on Ely's seminal interventions on property rights, but these studies do not address Ely's surplus approach to rent. It seems Ely's work on rent has been largely forgotten. Demonstrating the continuing importance of Ely, I draw on his original books and papers, along with existing wider analyses of his work, including reviews of his books published around the time that his books were first released. In doing so, in this paper, I seek to explain and evaluate Ely's distinctive approach to rent and to reflect on its significance in modern institutional economics and political economy more widely at the time of a resurgence in extractivism and renterism. Like other surplus theorists, Ely rejected the income approach to rent common in neoclassical economics. However, unlike other surplus theorists, Ely recognize that landowners bear substantial costs, so not all the rents going to them should be socialized. He contended that the rent going to landlords was justified so long as they put their private property to social uses. If they failed to do so, and hence inequality continued to increase or remained entrenched, again Ely broke ranks with other surplus theorists by refraining from the use of revolutionary political processes. Instead, he preferred evolutionary transformation in the form of changes in laws, and notably, appeal to the courts to intervene in addressing growing inequalities. This emphasis on law and rules also distinguishes Ely's approach to land, which other surplus theorists considered as a unity. For Ely, land was not only a bundle of sticks with diverse interests and tenures, land rent also differs based on use, type of land, and change of use and land type, along with the typical surplus approach emphasis on, let's say, location and fertility. In this sense, like Marx's theory of rent, Ely's surplus approach is historically specific against absolutism and crude determinism. However, unlike Marx's theorizing, Ely's approach was evolutionary rather than revolutionary, and his bundle of sticks approach far more granular. In general, Ely's specific surplus approach created a quote unquote golden mean with three defining features, namely, offering a critique of the status quo, providing the principles undergirding evolutionary alternatives, and providing concrete practical steps or policies for creating an inclusive society. Ely contemplated the limits of his surplus approach. For instance, he suggested that if the courts failed, new judges could be appointed. Concurrently, commissions of inquiry could be established and used to pursue reform. However, he was less successful in foreseeing the tendency for property rights to entrench inequality and how that inequality itself gives power over the courts. Also, he overlooked the various ways in which the courts are stratified and racialized. The difficulties of simply appointing new judges in such a racialized environment was not carefully analyzed either. More fundamentally, Ely paradoxically endorsed the global intersections of national inequalities and entrenched stratification. Now, to flesh out these arguments, the rest of the paper is divided into three sections. First section is Rent and Surplus, explains Ely's conceptualization of rent, stressing how it differs from other theorizations of rent. Rent and Distribution discusses how Ely's surplus approach to rent is applied in the analysis of property and maldistribution. Critiques and Contradictions shows the limitations of Ely's approach. Now, number two, Rent and Surplus. Rent features prominently in Ely's political economy. While many political economists equate rent and surplus, Ely considered some, but not all, rent to be surplus. In his article Land Income of 1928, he clarified how his three-part contribution relates to neoclassical economics, classical economics, and institutional economics. For both neoclassical and classical economics, he offered critiques, paving the way for his attempt to make a positive contribution to institutional economics. Neoclassical economics regards rent as a payment for the use of land, itself a gift of nature whose value is determined through the interaction of supply and demand. According to Ely, none of these is accurate. Ely considered rent to be a payment for more than land use. Rent reflects privilege for the use of a multiplicity of property rights in land, which is itself made up of several rights altogether, not a unity. Ely was one of the early exponents of the notion that property is a bundle of rights, not the singular view of property so commonly held in neoclassical economics. This emphasis on rights and economics also made Ely a pioneer of the economics approach to law, the law and economics approach, or the law approach to economics, the combination of which is much bigger than the total of the various parts. For instance, the bundle of rights metaphor for Ely also signified an evolutionary approach to social inclusion, not simply a meme of laws and rights. In Ely's political economy of rent, therefore, the courts are clearly central in settling questions of rent and social injustice. In neoclassical economics, too, property rights need to be guaranteed by the courts of law. But in the case of Ely, they are not absolute rights of an abstract or isolated individual, but social arrangements to be justified because they serve definite social economic means. Definite social economic ends. The courts in Ely's surplus approach do not simply favor the landlord, but they consider the social good of private property. Ely's approach differs from other surplus approaches, at least in three aspects. That is, firstly, land is not a free resource of nature. Secondly, not all rent is surplus. Thirdly, although contingent rather than categorical, Ely's proposed solution to the surplus problem is to be found in the courts. Explaining these three differences is crucial for appreciating the essence of Ely's surplus approach. Starting with whether land is free for Ely is fundamental. Unlike in the classical economics tradition of surplus value, which considers that land is a gift, neither land nor land use is free in Ely's surplus approach to rent. There are waiting and ripening costs to be borne by the user of the land. For these reasons, land income, Ely's preferred expression for land rent, is not simply the product of supply and demand. He recognizes location advantages, the role of public investments, luck, and uncertainty in determining rent, but how they influence rent is shaped by both land use type, land use form, and the change between land uses ranging from mineral land, agricultural land, urban land, and forest land to many other types of land. The second difference between Ely's approach and other surplus approaches relates to whether all rent is surplus. In many of the surplus approaches, rent is an extra payment received over and above what non-privileged people receive, or rent is the extra payment received over subsistence levels. Alternately, rent could be seen as anything that's owed to labor after it's been paid an exploitation wage. There is also rent as economic surplus, which Ely considers the most similar to his approach. Now, according to him, this rent or economic surplus is the excess over and above what is required to secure the application of the requisites of production. What sets Ely apart is that his reading of surplus was unlike most classicals who contended that any payment that exceeds what is socially necessary for the factor of production to be used is to be considered as rent or surplus. Karl Marx used surplus value to denote anything in excess of what is paid to labor. Henry George, on the other hand, generally considered all land income to be unearned increment and hence postulated that the annualized retail value of land should be taxed away while removing taxes on labor and capital. Ely's proposed solution to rent-based problems also set his approach apart from other surplus frameworks. Ely recognized that privilege and interests, even insider group trading and information, can pave the way for extraordinary advances to accrue to individual landlords. That is, that society creates the conditions for rent. He called this influence of group characteristics a group relationship theory of land income. However, he maintained that the broad-based surplus approach is problematic. It's not the privileges per se that generate the increases in value, but the public facilities. However, even these so-called unearned incomes are earned because individual landlords do incur costs. Ely points to waiting costs and ripening costs as examples. Accordingly, contended that landlords must be compensated for the cost of waiting and of deferring the use of land to a future date. To the charge that speculative investments should be discouraged, Ely argued that such speculation is justified because often land investors need to acquire adjoining parcels of land if they consider that other uses to which such lots could be used would hamper the realization of the full potential of the land. So, speculation is socially necessary. Ely also argued that land can suffer decrements. That is, if rent can increase, they can also fall. In Ely's expression, there are both unearned increments and likewise unearned decrements. For all these risks, landlords should not be assumed to always benefit from unearned income. It is suggestive of serious mistakes, wrote Ely, that the consideration of land rent and land income has not been closely connected with the consideration of costs. The classical view of the rent of land is that it is income without costs. Still, Ely's approach to rent is based on the surplus approach in a narrower sense. In his text, Outlines of Land Economics, under, quote, definition of surplus used in this work, Ely wrote, the economic surplus is that which is paid over and above such a return to those who are engaged in production as will induce them to do their part fully and efficiently in the work of production. Of the five forms of surplus, Ely names rent of land as the first, the rest being interest, personal surplus, monopoly gains, and gains of conjecture. Now, contrary to the classicals, Ely makes a distinction between surplus and socially useful surplus. This latter is surplus which, when taken back from rent via tax, for example, the land investors will be so demoralized that they will give less than optimal contribution to land investment. Finally, Ely's preference is to use the courts to address problems of surplus and rent. However, unlike others who are more categorical about such claims, Ely insisted that his position of rent was not cast in stone. Rent was one of the fields of research he set out in his course about and vision of land economics. There were three aspects in these endeavors: description, definition, and determination of the claims about rent. In terms of description, he argued that the field of land economics should focus on evolutionary changes in the use of the terms, to analyze the significance in the use of the term, and to evaluate how rent is used both in science and in the market. In terms of definition, he insisted on rent as power or privileged position. Both of these percolate his third charge, that is, to offer empirical assessments of rental theories continuously, including the effects of custom and competition on rent. Reflecting the influence of the German historical school on Ely, his surplus approach is historically specific, against determinism and absolutism. These features also Ely's approach to extractivism and distribution. Number three, rent extractivism and distribution. To examine how Ely's surplus approach is applied to the analysis of extractivism, structural or long-term inequality, examining his book, 1914, Property and Contract in Their Relations to the Distribution of Wealth, is critical because of its use of a wealth or as weal, W-E-A-L, or that which produced well-being. A central issue in the analysis of global social problems about extractivism, as in resource extractivism. Wealth, as a concept, has many intertwined aspects, namely economic wealth and social wealth. Private wealth, Ely explains, means economic goods which yield utilities to the individual, and it may even mean something which detracts from social wealth. Now, even though private wealth includes legitimate and proper claims on others, private wealth is a concept which belongs primarily to a discussion of individual distribution, while social wealth is a concept which receives special emphasis in production. Public and social wealth may be similar. For example, a post office, but not all public, that is, state wealth, is social wealth. It is from this formulation that Ely develops his approach to distribution. In the text Property and Contract, 1914, he sets out to build on this formulation. In doing so, he argues that distribution is more about ownership than location. While Ely's questions, such as in whose hand do they rest as property, that is, who has the right to consume them, to sell them, to give them away, have a Marxian ring, his question, what are the underlying economic institutions upon which the economic structure rests, takes the analysis one step beyond the Marxist structuralist perspective. Ely's approach to the study of inequality is based on three questions. First, what is the distribution of income and wealth among the various units of the social organism? Next, what portion of this wealth produced is derived from or given back to land, labor, capital, or entrepreneurship? Thirdly, then, what institutions support the present economic structure? Marxists typically leave their analysis at the second level in the inquiry, while for Ely, the third aspect constitutes the fundamental issue. The third line of inquiry is concerned with the underlying economic institutions upon which our whole economic structure rests. The fundamentals have been much neglected. On page 6, Ely also equates institutions with foundation. Figure 1 is a schematic presentation of Ely's approach. And I think you can see this here, description of the outward appearance of maldistribution, examination of how the surplus arising from production is distributed among the factors of production, a third pole analysis of institutions that sustain maldistribution, and they are derived from, but interactive with, institutions as individual forces and institutions as social forces that are the function of conscious and unconscious forces, and unconscious social forces and social self-consciousness. Figure 1 is an annotated diagram of Ely's analysis of distribution. The institutions in the figure are fundamentals of the system. They come in the form of collective social forces that consciously or unconsciously shape inequality. Unconscious social forces are those that are not directed at distribution per se, that is, some laws, but end up having an impact on the question of distribution through the unequal application of these laws. The self-conscious forces called social self-consciousness are rather different. They're aimed at affecting the question of distribution. Now, they may come in the form of legislation, action, that is, judicial action, police action, executive or government action, and public opinion through praise, criticism, punishment, and reward. Social self-consciousness can also come in the form of social and interest group activity that lobby to change the distribution of incomes and wealth. Such lobby groups can be associations, labor organizations, consumer leagues, and religious groups. There is a relationship between the social self-conscious and the unconscious social forces in the sense that the unconscious may become affected by the conscious with the afflection of time, EFFLUXION, afflection of time, just as the conscious may evolve into unconscious forces with time. Individuals are not regarded as institutions in Ely's approach, but their actions interact with institutions. There's an agency question, see? Individual actions can be conscious, or individuals can unconsciously shape their proportion of wealth. Conscious actions, such as planning and training, may improve the individual's proportion of income and wealth. Unconscious actions, such as being disciplined, staying out of trouble, and study that is not aimed at improving the individual proportion of incomes and wealth, may all contribute to a greater stake in incomes. However, whether conscious or unconscious, such individual actions interact with institutions such as the media. Overall, it is the interaction of all these factors that shapes the distribution of income and wealth. As Ely notes, quote, "We have the incomes which come to us partly because we work for them, in part because we have them because society has decided that we should have them. And not infrequently, we have them because certain social forces, operating more or less unconsciously, have cooperated with our own efforts to secure them, or have even procured them for us without any efforts on our part." Institutions, then, are the key forces for Ely. The institution of inheritance and the movement of property values are given by Ely as classic examples of what society does for us in terms of getting a proportion of the incomes and wealth. These considerations lead to the question of how institutions are formed. For Ely, they are collectively created, not individually devised. In his own words, passing over to an examination of the fundamentals in the existing socioeconomic order, the first truth to note is that they are established not by individuals, not by nature, nor by nature, but by human society. Now, while institutions are crucial in this approach, it does not mean that institutions themselves are built by individual action. Institutional analysis consciously veers away from beginning with individual characteristics not only because it is institutions that matter, but also because individual actions have been constrained, enabled, and influenced by institutions over time, and they're still being molded by institutions. Of all the institutions of analysis, however, Ely centers his case on property, especially private property. In his own words, quote, the first fundamental institution in the distribution of wealth is the sphere of private property, unquote. To illustrate this point, consider oil extractivism, renterism, or reprimarization. A range of scholars and activists and scholar activists reduce the process to mere extraction of oil, in which case every extraction of oil is extractivism, and hence the demand to leave oil in the ground. Others, notably Marxist scholars, consider extractivism as linked to the system of transnational extraction of oil. Thus, the ownership structure, along with the international division of labor, in which the global south is consigned the role of raw oil production, and the global north supplies the tools needed to do the extraction and processing, are all extractivists, meaning that they come with little or no structural transformation in the economy, for example, through local centered industrialization. In this sense, colonialism was an extractivist regime because it transferred oil rents from the global south to the global north by disinvesting in oil and other infrastructure to ensure socioeconomic transformation of oil economies. With the growing power of transnational corporations, Marxists argued that it would be impossible to bargain with them. In this respect, since it's difficult to bargain with transnational colonial imperial state complex for rent, Marxists advocated the nationalization of oil resources. This highly influential position inspired many post-colonial oil economies to create national oil companies to socialize the rents from oil. See Mexico, Venezuela, Cuba, etc. Examples of such national oil companies are Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and until recently, Mexico. Yet, as is now well known, even when oil wells have been nationalized, oil institutions have still transferred resources into the hands of private entities. Perhaps the issue is not so much capital, nor or not solely capital, industrialization, and state-based growth. It's also land, wider socio-ecological transformation, and inclusive change. Quote from Ely, conservation policies are then land policies. Conservation means three things vis-a-vis number one, maintenance as far as possible. Number two, improvement where possible. Three, justice in distribution. Ely points to a tendency for concentration through private property rights. Conservation is considered to show that it is, first of all, a problem of property relation. Yet, property is a poorly understood concept. Even in property economics, supposedly the center for the study of economics of property, property is confusingly regarded as a thing. Often real estate and possession of property confused with ownership of property. Property rights analysts add a layer of rights to explain property by demanding that property be regarded as a quote unquote bundle of rights exercised over a thing, often real estate and land. Ely also uses the bundle of rights metaphor, but he shifts the emphasis from property relations to social relations. Now, according to him, the essence of property is in the relations among men arising out of their relation to things. For the purpose of rent theories, Ely's focus suggests a double shift, first from individuals to property, and second, from property to society. Therefore, property connotes class, status, and position. Property is not merely individuals having that bundle of rights, individuals exercising certain rights over things, or, quote, the category of legal doctrines concerned with allocating rights to material resources, unquote, as new and legal institutional economics perspectives hold. Now, if property implies class, subclasses, and intergroup differences, then so does rent. Its payments could vary according to group position, and its very existence is a spark for and maintains inequality and social stratification in an environment in which different groups pay different types of rent. In this sense, Ely delves into the workings of property, notably its A, characteristics, B, mode of transfer, and C, how it is established among various groups. Ely refers to the sphere of private property. This notion connotes two main features of property, its extensivity and intensivity. The extensivity of private property refers to how widespread is property which is individually owned. Intensivity refers to how many sticks are in the bundle of rights. Therefore, to consider property, the analyst must dig into both the breadth, extensivity, and depth, intensivity of private property, i.e., scale and scope. Ely also recognizes other types of tenure, namely public property exercised by a political unit, such as a city or a nation state, like, um, eminent domain, etc., and common property exercised by a social grouping, such as a community. While Ely's attention is centered on private property, to investigate property as a driver of inequality, all types must be analyzed. In doing so, the conditions under which property is held, the laws about the transfer of property, for example, taxation or no taxation, extensive or limited transfer taxes, and the evolution of property in both its intensivity and extensivity must be studied. Property itself may be classified as subjects, that is, classification according to actors, and objects, classification according to objects over which rights are exercised. Property subjects may be classified into common, private, and public property, while property objects may be human beings, land, and capital. It's also possible to classify property according to duration, for example, freeholds. Now, that being said, Ely points to the crucial test of being in the propertied class, ownership as distinct from possession. Mere possession of property does not confer property class status. According to Ely, this is why anarchists have strongly advocated that tenants in possession would rather have their possession commuted to ownership. Ownership confers the right of exclusivity, alienation, and appropriation, while possession does not necessarily confer these property rights. Applying his approach to the distribution of wealth as it relates to property and property rights in the 21st century illustrates the point further. There's a diagram here, which is a little small, I'm sorry to say. It's the key argument about the tendency under the social theory of property. Let's see if I can. Here you go. Rules of transfer, systems of property rights that range from common to private, common, public, and private. That is, customs, mores, state rules, or market forces. And then unearned decrement, dispossession. Recall, of course, dispossession in the Harvey sense, unearned increment, and concentration. So there are tendencies under the social theory of property. The process of growing rent itself is disempowering for the poor because they're forced to move away from central areas to the margins. For some landlords, the process of concentrating property rights works to the advance of risky loans. In this process, there is much dispossession aided by both state and market rules interacting with customs and mores. Two examples of how this works are the non-application of land taxation and the removal of all taxes that constitute a brake on the private acquisition of land. This argument and the approach on which it is based is substantially different from neoclassical or neo-institutional economics, that is, mainstream economics in this paper, typically based on general equilibrium analysis and Kuznets' ideas of inequality. For mainstream economists, inequality is not necessarily considered to be bad because it can be an incentive to hard work. Second, inequality is the result of individual effort or sloth, such that the difference between the incomes and wealth can be attributed to hard work or laziness. Otherwise, in general, inequality tends towards disappearance in the form of a spatial equilibrium. The neoclassical approach to the study of wealth and income concentrates largely on the economic aspects of wealth, not its social aspects. When land is studied, the primary assumptions are that private property motivate its owners to work hard, invest, and trade in land, which in turn will improve the social conditions of landowners and support national economic growth. However, this approach suffers conceptual bias because for most land in the global south, for example, Africa and the Pacific, neither of these assumptions is valid. Instead, land and property are communally held, managed, and used such that even when individual kith and kin pursue personal aspirations with quote unquote their land, the use must be governed by and in pursuit of the collective good broadly defined. So, there is no congruence between neoclassical assumptions and the real land economy of customary landowners. Neo-institutional economics, NIE, on the other hand, accepts that neoclassical economics is in error in making methodological individualist assumptions about customary land tenure. However, NIE, New Institutional Economics, assumes that such customary systems will ipso facto evolve to Western land tenure systems, without acknowledging counter-hegemonic forces that resist such evolution and the autonomous development of customary land tenure. For example, some people, familial land holdings, particularly urban land holdings in China, go back centuries, are described as, quasi-dynastic in that sense. The argument in this paper, drawing on Ely's approach, runs against both neoclassical and new institutional economics for these reasons. The argument in this paper is also quite distinct from Marxian analysis and claims. For Marxists, inequality is reprehensible and under the capitalist mode of production is persistent and expansionary. The source of inequality for Marxists is the capitalistic exploitation of labor. A rich body of Marx's work on land has recently been analyzed, but in general, Marx's political economy, land is of secondary importance. So, Marxists tend to seek changes in the distribution of surplus value and the economic structure. Now, Ely's approach, by comparison, is much wider. Focused on institutions that support the economic structure, land is of particular interest. In this sense, Ely's pursuit of just distribution is akin to that of Henry George, but his approach differs from that of George in many respects. For instance, in terms of the weight that Ely gives to other institutions and their relationship with property rights, in terms of how inequalities need to be addressed, and in terms of whether all rent is to be regarded as surplus. Nevertheless, Ely's institutionalism complements other heterodox approaches rather than demolishing them. Therefore, Ely's surplus approach to rent is one more scaffold not only to build a heterodox alternative, but also to more deeply mark the terrain and intellectual apparatus of original institutional economics and political economy in general. Critiques and contradictions. Ely has been widely criticized. Concerns have ranged from his apparent support of propertied interests to his non-commitment to the founding ideals of the United States. Some have pointed to his handling of legal material as being of a slipshod character. Others point to his overly optimistic view about the neutrality of judges. Ely himself suggested many ways to overcome such challenges, either by using existing legislation or creating new legislation. As noted by Swayze in 1915, quote, the right of taxation, the right of eminent domain, the right to exercise the police power, the right to control transfers, especially by way of inheritance, the right to exempt certain property from education and distress in order that a man may not be deprived of the means of doing his part in the world by working at his trade or calling, unquote. Ely also suggested a flexible system in which new judges are appointed to overturn archaic judicial philosophies and practices. But these positions have been criticized. For example, quote, it is far better to wait until public opinion is finally settled on a disputed question, and time makes it possible to determine whether proposed changes are real reforms or not. Now, with respect to his surplus approach to rent, these criticisms need to be extended in at least two respects, centered mainly on questioning his theorizing of inequalities and his trust in the police power. The surplus approach to rent locates inequalities primarily at the national level, where race, gender, class, nor other identities are considered seriously. Yet, as a large body of research has shown, the rise in inequalities is not only at the national level, but can be seen at the subnational, regional, and global levels. Now, whatever the scale, inequalities have taken particular identity lines ranging from caste, color, and class to gender, disability, and sexuality, among others. These inequalities and social stratification arise from different underlying institutions and historical periods, and they have entirely different geographical forms. However, they have all tended to lead to similar outcomes: dispossession, discrimination, and concentration. In the United States, this privatization of land has had a distinctive racial orientation, as we see in N.D.B. Connolly's 2014 book, A World More Concrete: Real Estate and the Remaking of Jim Crow. The process of instituting private property was also the process of establishing white supremacy. Not only have zoning laws, the use of state power of eminent domain, and so-called campaigns to improve housing for African Americans in ghettos ended up dispossessing and displacing African Americans of their land, but also these forces of stratification have locked them into the rental market as renters or subprime mortgagors and associated them with undesirable features. For example, crime, grime, drugs, and dereliction that drive down property values, while white Americans had made millions off them in rent and mortgage payments. See redlining. While there have been black property owners, and they've collaborated with white property owners, for example, by lending each other money to pursue property empires, the institutions in that country have made it increasingly difficult for them to expand their property holdings. For example, by making it much more difficult to obtain the types of loan that white property owners can access to surge ahead. Such Jim Crow barriers matter. But as Darity and Mullen have shown recently, these processes of racialized wealth inequalities extended from the era of slavery through Jim Crow to modern multiples of discrimination and privilege. In Africa, the number of sticks in the bundle of private property rights has significantly increased. Common water is now being fenced off and being parceled out as part of the sphere of private property, as we see in the recent book by John Anthony Allen and his colleagues, The Handbook of Land and Water Grabs in Africa of 2013. In Ely's terminology, then, both the extensivity and intensivity of private property have been substantially widened, but they have concentrated wealth in private and racially privileged hands. None of these engaged Ely's attention in his time. It is not that Ely was unaware of persistent stratification. He was, but he thought it was deserved, often canvassing a particular type of eugenics in which so-called inferior races would be oppressed to such a level that they would be exterminated. Quote, We have got far enough to recognize that there are certain human beings who are absolutely unfit and should be prevented from a continuation of their kind. Unquote. Negroes, Ely noted, are for the most part grown up children and should be treated as such. Ely campaigned to exclude immigrants from opportunities because he considered them to be racially inferior. He campaigned against giving work to the disabled to pave way for the worthy poor, while he deemed white people to be of the quote unquote superior classes. Ely, unfortunately, in short, echoed the dark, illiberal side of progressive institutional economists who sought protection for women, but not equality with them. Ely, for example, deemed women to be biologically weaker and hence in need of protection. Accordingly, Ely's surplus approach overlooks, even reinforces the color of rent and the multiple identities of those marginalized by the extraction of rent across the uneven landscape of global political economy, both in terms of analysis and proposed ways of addressing the problem. Yet, in these processes, it is the majority of poor peasants, migrants, politically marginalized, blacks, women, nomads, and others of minority identities who give up or are made to give up their land and from whom community water is taken. Research published in Feminist Economics established that women's land is often the first and easiest targets. Established plantations disrupt long-standing gendered roles that guarantee certain jobs for women by employing men, often from different communities, to take up women's jobs. Mining and drilling activities surged at the height of land grabs, for example. Often the winners do not control land forever, but the process can range from 50 to 99 years. People are hardly consulted as powerful groups take unilateral decisions, or government officials, even in clear contravention of the law, are overexcited about the social benefits the project will bring, and hence the social theory of this private property movement is that enclosures are good for society. Enclosures are good for society. Jobs, technology, knowledge transfer, foreign exchange and modernization, development, and positive social change have all been promised as a justification for these enclosures, albeit they have remained just that, promises. In effect, these multiple transformations have transferred rent from the global south to the global north, from blacks to whites, from men to women, from weaker classes, castes, and colors to more powerful groups. The outcomes have been changing property relations in favor of the rich, wealthy, and the mighty. That is, Polanyi's quote unquote great transformation has generated stratified, hierarchical property relations characterized nearly always with the weaker groups taking the lower and more precarious position in the property ladder. In the case of real estate, indebted mortgage recipients live with the myth that they're property owners when in fact they only possess property and hold conditional rights that can be easily terminated by the real property owners. Banks, doubling as speculators, and landlords who double as bankers, supported by a wide range of professional valuers and real estate organizations. In the case of agrarian relations, proletariats become converted into wage labor, sometimes for 50 years, others for much longer. So while the land will ultimately return to the landowning communities, community members will have long passed on, especially in countries where the life expectancy is less than 70 years, or they become more wretched than they were prior to the process. By country, the top 10 appropriators as of 2012 were the USA, Malaysia, the UK, China, the United Arab Emirates, South Korea, India, Australia, and South Africa, while countries in sub-Saharan Africa provide 70% of all land captured. Leon's more recent work suggests that these figures are accurate. Most of the land purchased has been located in Africa, and most of the centers from which the purchases have been financed are the world's super rich or rich cities, most notably New York, London, Singapore, Seoul, and Kuala Lumpur. 75% of the time, the land acquired in such processes is to put the cultivation of biofuel plants, being a change of their previous use for food or non-food uses. Now, the rest is put to food cultivation, but mainly for export purposes. In turn, access to local food consumption has become insecure or expensive for those in weaker property relations. So, the increase in global food security is mainly for the so-called developed regions, for which both the number and percentage of people who are undernourished are on the decline. As shown in Table 1, such regions have consistently recorded a decline in undernourishment problems, quote, a state lasting for at least 1 year of inability to acquire enough food defined as a level of food intake insufficient to meet dietary energy requirements, close quote. And there's a table that talks about insufficient food intake across the world by region from 1990 to 2014 and its relation to, of course, land acquisition. So you can see where the negative areas are. Now, from Table 1, Africa, that is sub-Saharan and North Africa, where most parcels of land have been taken up in the ongoing global process of private enclosure, is the region with the worst trends in feeding its people. While the causes of undernourishment are many and certainly not simply restricted to the loss of land, the trend in Africa is not a mere question of correlation. Rather, the reduction of land available for food production is a major contributor to the maldistribution of the burden of food insecurity, which in turn feeds into the problem of undernourishment. As noted in the Africa Agricultural Status Report, quote, large acquisitions by nationals and foreigners in other countries have greatly increased inequality. From the seller's point of view, there's concern about distress sales, where poor households have no alternative for meeting emergencies than to sell their land at very low prices. Land taken is typically used for agribusiness. As Timothy Wise has shown in his latest book, Eating Tomorrow, such a regime of agriculture undermines ecologically sustainable agriculture with its emphasis on genetically modified seeds, excessive emphasis on the use of agro-based fertilizer and other chemicals, and the insistence on viewing agriculture as a for-profit business. Wise's work is revealing. Most farmers he's interviewed in Africa are opposed to agribusiness. He refers to his interviews with female farmers in Mozambique who reject agribusiness because, for the farmers, such food system only serves the interest of the West and the local landlord class. Seeds of opposition, to quote The Economist, were sown in Mozambique eventually. Pro Savannah, a corporate initiative aimed at turning 107,000 square kilometers, a large tract of land analogous to the size of Bulgaria, into a food basket, was launched in 2009. By 2019, not much progress had been made. Rather, plans had been afoot to raise $2 billion in private equity funds for another agribusiness in 2013. By 2019, such was the opposition that The Economist described the situation as quote unquote stony ground. Stefan Uma has offered a more systematic, more up to date account. The financialization of land and resulting dispossession and deprivation have become even more serious today. The question then is no longer whether such inequalities exist, but what institutional forces, or in the terminology of the regulationists, institutional forms, drive, sustain, and mold the trends in the distribution of wealth in relation to property. Now, whether the police power intended to ensure that such privatization and private capture of value is an effective check requires careful analysis. In his tome, Legal Foundations of Capitalism, J.R. Commons, Ely's student, carefully documents the changing meanings of police power in the American and the English courts. The courts will often take a larger view of value in the economy than neoclassical economists would, because the courts consider the economy as constituted by the interaction or transaction between two people, plaintiff and defendant, constituting electrons in motion, not individuals, atomistic individuals whose actions are static, as in neoclassical economics. Yet, even the courts cannot ipso facto confirm what is reasonable value and how the police power might be used, as the use depends on the particular location, time, and constitutional provisions. Nowhere is this contingent interpretation better demonstrated than in India, where judicial decisions on the question of public and private space have been shifting dramatically from pro-marginalized groups' interests to business interests. The state and its agencies, even in the days of pro-hawker judicial decisions, have always found ways around court decisions to pursue their own interest. Elsewhere, in many cases, courts have used the police power to favor the rich. In one case, this police power was exercised in favor of investors who have been misled into investing in a private land venture in Togo, West Africa. Lynn Ossom has conducted a detailed analysis of police power which seeks to answer the question, quote, can the law secure women's rights to land in Africa, unquote. After considering the evidence, she notes, quote, there still is no conclusive evidence of the viability of customary law's efficacy in securing women's rights to land. Rather, contemporary land deals take place in the context of a legal, political, and economic terrain that requires constant negotiation and reinterpretation in line with the lived realities of communities and women within them. This study demonstrates that customary law is not yet exhausted as an avenue for redress. It exposes the colonial fallacies upon which the customary was based, the attempts to put it aside, and the assumptions that underlay these attempts. It also examines the problematic nature of formalization in the context of land acquisitions, which in essence pits the state against itself, unquote. Now, while this evidence relates to customary law, the research findings about constitutional law and courts follow similar patterns. John Mabaku's research on constitutional protection of minority rights in Africa makes the point. According to him, constitutional structure and constitutional making are contingent on socio-historical context. Forcibly united under colonialism, countries such as Cameroon have tried to build constitutions, but such documents are exclusive not only in their rules, but also in their application and enforcement. The Supreme Court of Ghana might be much more inclusive both in how the Ghanaian Constitution was drafted and is interpreted. For both the U.S. Supreme Court and the South African Supreme Court have been exclusive and ideologically biased against minorities. Typically, the rules of court, constitutional provisions, the complicity of judges and lawyers, and the wider political economies of the two countries combine to concentrate land in the hands of white, wealthy, and powerful landlord classes. Fundamentally, whether inclusive or exclusive, long-term inequalities, social stratification, and property concentration have increased in Africa and elsewhere in the world. Indeed, in the U.S., research shows that James Buchanan, the leading theorist behind the public choice school of economics, conceived of the Supreme Court as an institution to support white propertied interests rather than as an instrument of harmonious arbitration between the landlords and ordinary members of American society. Not only are black judges in the minority, research shows that their decisions are more likely to be overturned on appeal. That said, this contingency does not amount to a concerted effort by lawyers and judges to create what Marxists perceive to be a deliberate institutional framework to encourage extractivism for foreign interests. Nigerian courts, for instance, have tried to constrain extractivisms of various kinds when seeking to bring transnational oil companies under their jurisdiction. International law itself has been complicit in creating concepts such as terra nullius, which have been used to justify extractivisms, and many imperial courts, like those in Britain, still make decisions on many occasions to favor the transnational corporations from the imperium. While the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, the ICC, has promised to prosecute land grabbers at the ICC, no such action has taken place. If it does, there is no guarantee of success. It follows that the police power is no guarantee as suggested by Ely's surplus approach to rent. Conclusion, finally. Rent is central to political economic discussion of long-term inequality and social stratification. However, rent is largely neglected in neoclassical economic analysis of inequality. The surplus approach to rent tries to rectify this problem. The social theory of property advanced by Ely offers a distinctive contribution to the surplus approach to rent. Not only does it differ from other surplus approaches in terms of its analysis of how rents arise, Ely's surplus approach is also distinctive in emphasizing land as a quote-unquote bundle of rights and reform, not via the socialization of rent for wider social policy or for workers' liberation, but through revisiting and revamping the courts. Yet, as the evidence in this paper has shown, the social trust bestowed upon private property owners has long been broken, and the police power offered as a check on the excesses of private property ownership is way too limited to serve as an effective constraint on the property class. The concentration of land wealth is dramatically normalized, and pre transformation property relations have been molded in diverse, different, and differentiated ways across scales and over time, particularly in the extractivist forms of accumulation. Now, not all of these are surprising. Ely's surplus approach is more strongly focused on national, not multiscalar global inequalities and global social stratification. Inherent in the social theory of property rights is structural bias against racial and other minorities. As discussed in this paper, the surplus approach also places too much categorical weight on the police power, which in practice is clearly contingent. Marxian revolutionary alternatives are similarly uncertain. Other evolutionary surplus approach alternatives, including Georgist political economy, are a bit more certain. Drawing on multi-level state power, community, and global institutions, a Georgist alternative can more reliably socialize rent as surplus. The trouble with all the surplus approaches is that they are either race blind or racist. At the same time, it could be analytically useful to bring Ely back into the debate about the social theory of property and the distribution of wealth in extractivist and rentier societies and link inequalities to institutions, notably the courts. In this way, Ely is one antidote to Buchanan in the sense that he sees institutions as one set of ways to transform society in an evolutionary, inclusive way. But like Buchanan, Ely's theorizing also explicitly sought to subjugate minorities, especially black people. Now, if Ely's theorizing can succeed in this role, therefore, then his theory has to be emptied of its problematic underpinnings, which can be helpfully be replaced by stratification economics, pioneered by black political economists to become the most advanced school of institutional and evolutionary political economy on intergroup inequalities, analysis of which is a story for another time. Now, what is stressed even now is that the surplus approach to rent can benefit from the broad approach offered by the regulation school. This school of thought seeks a historic approach that links previous socioeconomic and ecological processes to present ones. For example, rentier processes to new extractivist processes. This school of thought often also provides the canvas for an open-ended approach to uniting or amalgamating diverse forms of institutional and evolutionary alternatives. The aim is usually to question orthodoxy, more deeply understand, and more comprehensively change uneven and unequal global political economy. Clearly, one way for stratification to advance is for it to take the driving seat in the surplus approach to rent. Okay, got to the end of the article, and what I've been reading from is Franklin Obeng Udum's article, "The Surplus Approach to Rent." It's worth talking about. It is contingent in the sense that relying on various folks like Ely and Buchanan are problematic from a kind of orthodox point of view. And of course, Franklin tries to set in context issues of racialism or racism or bias in the question of equitable disposition of property. And he also tries to delimit, characterizing Marxist analysis in sort of one form as being sort of overdetermined in terms of labor, et cetera, when in fact, if you consider it as labor, it is more universalized in that sense, at least from that perspective. So anyway, all very useful because it is a kind of, retconning, as it were. It is a revision of stating some ideas about institutional economics, which were important for its time, that is, during the end of the Gilded Age and sort of the beginning of neoclassical orthodoxy. So it's all of a piece. It is, I think, the key element here is to consider this relation between surplus or surplus value and rent, and to note that rent is not as singular or absolute. It is more differentiated, but on the other hand, as an absolute form, can be also institutional. So it is a much wider terrain. It is about stratification, as Franklin points out. And I think all of these leave open certain ideas about extraction, um, exclusion, um, uh, a variety of interrelated economies relative to not only property, but also global north, global south, a variety of ways in which one can think about rent not as a singular matter, but of course, and obviously much more differentiated, whether it's ground rent versus building rent, or zoning and eminent domain, and a variety of other topics, which we'll get to eventually. Thank you very much. I will, seeing no questions in the chat, I will stop share and stop the live stream. Stop